Play it again. Rewind it. Did you hear what that bitch just said on a live microphone? The feed froze on a single crystalline frame that would soon be seared into the retinas of millions. Victoria Sterling, wife of real estate titan Richard Sterling, stood bathed in the arrogant glow of stage lights, her crimson dress a slash of blood against the cool blue backdrop. Her arms were stretched wide, not in welcome, but like a cruel empress delivering a verdict. Her voice, sharp and brittle as shattered champagne glass, sliced through the ballroom's polite applause. "This," she sneered, her eyes locking on the woman in the front row, "is not for farm girls." The echo of her words in that grand hall was nothing compared to the deafening roar it was about to become on the internet. Within a single hour, that sentence detonated. It wasn't just a comment, it was a cultural bomb. It became headlines, hashtags, and 1,000 viciously funny parodies that spread like a digital plague. Victoria Sterling hadn't just spoken. She had self-immolated. Before we dissect the glorious, slow-motion incineration of her empire, I need to know where you're watching this story unfold from. Light up the comments with your city, your state, your country. Let me see the global community we're building, and if you believe that dignity is non-negotiable and justice should be served, whether in a courtroom or the court of public opinion, then smash that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. These stories are more than just gossip. They are modern-day fables, and your engagement fuels the fire. We're so damn glad you're here. Now, let's get back to the woman they tried to break. Back to the Black CEO, Ava Monroe. On phone screens across the globe, the moment played on a torturous loop. Twitter, TikTok, the late-night comedy circuit. They all had their pound of flesh. Victoria Sterling, in her red dress, was seen laughing afterward, a smug, self-satisfied chuckle, convinced she had swatted a fly, put an upstart back in her place. But the high-definition cameras of 2025 are unforgiving goddesses. They lie for no one. Every contemptuous curl of her lip, every flicker of disdain in her eyes, was magnified, analyzed, and judged by a jury of millions. The world wasn't laughing with her. They were pointing, and they were furious. Through it all, Ava Monroe hadn't uttered a single sound. In the viral footage, she was a statue of defiance. She stood tall, a vibrant column of orange in a sea of muted black and gray suits. Her posture was as straight and unyielding as the steel skeletons of the skyscrapers she financed. In her hand, she held a simple black contract folder, gripping it with a firmness that spoke volumes. The cameras, hungry for her reaction, captured only her silence. It was a silence so profound, so heavy, it carried more weight than 1,000 screams ever could. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't fall, didn't even blink. It remained fixed on the stage, a calm, piercing stare that held steady while a hurricane of humiliation raged around her. The comment sections were a wildfire. "Why is this happening in 2025? This is racism and classism in a $10,000 dress. I don't know who she is, but I stand with Ava Monroe. Farm girl. Honey, that farm girl probably owns the land your penthouse is built on." Victoria Sterling, insulated by a lifetime of privilege, had made a fatal miscalculation. She had underestimated the world outside her gilded ballroom. Out there, in the real world, dignity had a fierce and loyal army, and that army was growing louder with every passing second. By dawn, the story had transcended social media. Cable news anchors were replaying the video with solemn faces. The chyrons at the bottom of the screen told the story in stark, brutal text. Humiliation at $4.50 billion Olympus Tower Gala sparks national outrage. The phones inside the Sterling empire began to buzz with a frantic, incessant panic. Sponsors called, their voices cold with corporate fury. PR teams scrambled, trying to plug a hole in a dam that had already burst. Victoria hadn't just insulted a guest. She had publicly executed her husband's brand in front of a global audience. She had taken a swing at a queen, and the internet was sharpening its guillotines. Ava, however, moved differently. There was no desperate press release, no tearful Instagram live. She let the world's outrage speak for her. She understood a fundamental law of power that Victoria never would. Silence, when held with unwavering strength, becomes a weapon far sharper than any scandal. And while Victoria Sterling began to drown in a storm of her own creation, Ava Monroe was already in her office, skyline behind her, planning her next move. A move that no one, least of all the woman in the blood-red dress, would ever see coming. The video didn't just trend, it became a cultural landmark. In 48 hours, the clip of Victoria Sterling's manicured finger pointing accusingly at Ava Monroe had blazed past 100 million views. It was more than a moment. It was a monument to arrogance. News outlets, sensing a ratings bonanza, looped the insult under bold, declarative captions. Not for farm girls. TikTok, the great cultural blender of our time, ingested the phrase and spat it out as 1,000 different memes. They spliced Victoria's sneering face with images of dusty barns dissolving into gleaming skyscrapers. They edited farm animals next to the pristine architectural model of the $4.5 billion Olympus Tower on the gala stage. Victoria's laugh, that carefree, smug, dripping with superiority sound, was now the internet's official soundtrack for entitled mockery. Every self-satisfied smirk she flashed that night was frozen, remixed, and slowed down for maximum cringe. What she had intended as a moment of social triumph had become damning evidence in a global trial. Meanwhile, Ava Monroe appeared only in still frames, her image a stark counterpoint to the chaos. Her orange dress was a blaze of defiance against the sterile blue-white lights of the opening ceremony. A close-up of her face revealed eyes that were steady and lips pressed into a line of quiet, powerful restraint. TikTok captions under her image read, "This is the face of a queen who knows she doesn't have to raise her voice to be heard." Twitter threads meticulously deconstructed her body language, declaring, "This is what unshakable power looks like. No screaming, no crying, just knowing." She knows. The sponsors didn't just notice, they panicked. Clients saw it. The entire ecosystem of high-stakes real estate saw it. Even ordinary people who couldn't tell a mortgage from a mezzanine paused their scrolling, shared the clip, and commented, "It's 2025, and the old money dinosaurs are still acting like this." Imagine having the audacity to humiliate the woman who is literally holding the contract that makes your shiny new tower possible. Farm girl, she is the only person in that entire damn room acting with any royalty. At first, Victoria Sterling tried to brush it off with the casual disdain of the untouchable. She posed for an Instagram story later that night, still in her red cocktail dress, a glass of champagne in hand. The caption read, "Unbothered. Some people just don't belong." She thought it was a power move, a sign of her imperviousness. But the internet doesn't forgive arrogance twice. The post was inundated. Thousands of furious comments, a flood of angry emojis, and hashtags like #boycott_Sterling and #Victoria. The Vulture began to trend globally. The late-night comedians smelled blood in the water. One host leaned over his polished desk, a predatory grin on his face. "You know you've messed up," he said to the roaring studio audience, "when half the country is calling you the villain in someone else's origin story." But through it all, Ava Monroe remained a ghost. No interviews, no tweets, no carefully staged paparazzi shots of her looking sad but strong. Her silence became the central mystery of the story. News anchors posed the question to their panels. Why hasn't she spoken? Pundits and analysts speculated wildly. "She doesn't need to," one business strategist explained. "The numbers on the stock market will do all the talking for her." And while Victoria Sterling was busy fighting a losing battle in the trenches of the comment sections, her condescension only fanning the flames, Ava Monroe was meeting quietly with her advisors. Her presence was a pool of calm in a sea of panic. She didn't chase the narrative. She didn't try to control it. She let the storm rage, knowing with the precision of a master strategist exactly where it was heading. Because in a scandal of this magnitude, timing isn't just important. It's everything. And her timing, as the world was about to discover, was absolutely flawless. By the third day, the scandal had achieved a life of its own, a self-sustaining engine of outrage. Every major news network had adopted the same visual format, a split screen. On the left, Victoria Sterling, frozen mid-sneer, her arm extended like a blade, her lips curled with a venomous disdain. On the right, Ava Monroe, in her brilliant orange dress, chin lifted, holding her contract with the placid stillness of a monarch. The captions wrote themselves, "Disdain and dignity, the $4.50 billion stare down." Paparazzi, like vultures to a carcass, camped outside the Sterling's opulent Fifth Avenue penthouse. Every time Victoria dared to step outside, the street erupted in a blinding storm of flashbulbs. It wasn't the adoring light she was used to. It felt accusatory, like a trial. Reporters shouted questions that were more like accusations. "Do you regret your comment, Mrs. Sterling? Are you worried about losing investors?" Her only answer was a scoff, a wave of a dismissive hand. "Please," she was caught saying to a friend on a hot mic. "It was a joke. People need to develop thicker skin." But the world's skin was not the problem. Her comment was replayed on morning talk shows, where panels of analysts shook their heads in disbelief. "That isn't a joke," one commentator declared, her voice laced with contempt. "That is unchecked bias on a stage that was supposed to represent progress." Inside the gleaming corporate towers of Manhattan, the fallout wasn't measured in retweets, but in dollars and cents. The numbers were catastrophic. A major European sponsor for one of the Sterling's luxury residential projects quietly pulled their funding, issuing a terse statement about reputational concerns. Another international investment firm froze negotiations on a new development, citing the exact same reason. The Sterling Empire, once considered as solid and bulletproof as one of its own buildings, suddenly looked fragile, brittle. Meanwhile, Ava Monroe's silence continued to dominate the airtime. Networks, desperate for content, began inviting experts to interpret her restraint. A professor of business ethics from Columbia University appeared on CNN, explaining, "What we're seeing is a masterclass in power dynamics. Miss Monroe's silence is a strategic move. She's not just avoiding the mudslinging, she's controlling the entire frame. Every hour she doesn't speak, the focus remains squarely on Mrs. Sterling's arrogance, not on her own reaction." Social media wholeheartedly agreed. The hashtags evolved from outrage to admiration. #FarmGirlPower began trending, with users posting pictures of powerful women from all walks of life, scientists in labs, soldiers in uniform, entrepreneurs in boardrooms, with the tagline, "Not your stereotype, not your limit." And still, Ava said nothing. She was photographed only once, leaving a glass skyscraper in Midtown. There was no statement, no dramatic entourage. Just her, walking with a precise, unhurried gait through a marble lobby. The press captioned the photo, "Power in motion." In a desperate attempt to seize back control, Victoria Sterling launched an Instagram live stream. The camera angle was perfectly curated, her makeup flawless, her red lipstick a sharp slash against her pale skin. She began, her voice tight with forced composure. People are overreacting. I was simply defending tradition. Our industry has standards. It isn't for outsiders who don't understand our world. But the internet, in its infinite and merciless creativity, tore it apart. Clips of her words were re-edited into horror movie trailers, the soundtrack heavy with ominous boos and whispers. The comment sections lit up with fresh fury. She still doesn't get it. Defending tradition? Is that what we're calling bigotry now? The media cycle had become a ruthless, self-feeding beast. Outrage had turned into a spectacle. The spectacle had become entertainment. And entertainment had become leverage. Leverage that only one woman in this entire saga knew precisely how to wield. Because while Victoria Sterling was drowning in a sea of microphones and camera flashes, desperately trying to explain herself, Ava Monroe was already behind closed doors, speaking in the quiet, soundproofed rooms where the real deals, the deals that build and break empires, actually happen. The headlines screamed. The memes multiplied. Victoria Sterling was trending for all the wrong reasons, a caricature of privileged villainy painted by the entire world. Yet through the deafening roar of the public uproar, Ava Monroe remained a figure of absolute stillness in the public eye. But she was not absent. She was deliberate. In her private office, a sprawling space with glass walls that reflected the very skyline she had helped to finance, she sat at her polished obsidian desk. The infamous black contract folder rested beneath her hand. Her team of advisors was a chorus of anxious energy. PR specialists, lawyers, crisis managers. They all urged her to respond. They drafted statements for her, elegant paragraphs filled with words like grace and resilience, and sharp, cutting rebuttals framed as empowerment. She read none of them. Instead, she closed the folder, pushed it gently to the side, and looked at her frantic team. She spoke softly, her voice a calm anchor in their storm. "Dignity," she said, "doesn't need to scream. It waits for the right moment to strike." That single sentence carried the entire weight of her philosophy. It was a principle forged in fire. For years, she had navigated boardrooms where her presence was an anomaly, her voice consistently underestimated, her every move scrutinized. She had learned early and painfully that every public reaction is a transaction. Anger could be twisted into hysteria, words could be weaponized against her, but silence, a deliberate, controlled silence, was untouchable. It was a mirror that reflected the ugliness of her opponents right back at them. While Victoria Sterling ranted on live streams and posed for tabloid photographers, desperately trying to salvage her image, Ava Monroe charted patterns on a screen. She wasn't watching the news, she was watching the market. She studied how quickly sponsorship deals evaporated. She monitored the nervous chatter among investors, the whispers of instability that spread like a contagion through the financial world. Her staff brought her constant updates. An international partner is demanding a formal reassurance of brand stability. A major hedge fund is considering redirecting capital away from the Olympus project. She would simply nod, absorbing the information. No rushing, no pleading. She knew that markets don't respond to noise. They respond to confidence. And confidence radiates most powerfully when it doesn't need to flinch. The world began to notice this strange, powerful passivity. Commentators started framing her silence not as inaction, but as a calculated strategy. On a primetime financial news show, one anchor leaned forward, his voice hushed with a kind of reverence. Every word that comes out of Victoria Sterling's mouth digs her and her husband's empire into a deeper hole. And every word that is not spoken by Ava Monroe raises her higher. That's not passivity, ladies and gentlemen. That's power. For Ava herself, it was more than just strategy. It was a survival mechanism she had honed into an art form. She remembered every dismissive glance, Every condescending remark disguised as a compliment. Every room she had walked into where she was told, implicitly or explicitly, that she didn't belong. Now, standing in the eye of this global hurricane, she refused to fight in the way her opponent expected. She would not sling mud. She would not engage in a war of words. She chose instead to let the storm do the work for her, to let it reveal who was truly standing on solid ground. Night fell. The city lights began to shimmer against the glass of her office, wrapping around her like a suit of armor. She stood, walked toward the vast window, and looked out at the kingdom she had helped build. Victoria Sterling had screamed. The internet had roared. The press had speculated. But she waited, because she knew something fundamental about storms. They don't last. But reputations built on silence and steel? Those endure. The first tangible blow didn't come from a scathing headline or a viral meme. It came from the cold, unforgiving print of a balance sheet. A luxury hotel chain, a brand that had once proudly plastered its name across several of the Sterling's most prominent developments, issued a quiet, clinical press release. Due to ongoing reputational concerns, we are indefinitely suspending all further collaboration with Sterling Enterprises. It was brief. It was professional. But in the rarefied world of high-stakes capital, it was a thunderclap. Inside the glass and steel headquarters of the Sterling Empire, board members were in a state of barely concealed panic. Numbers don't have opinions. They don't have biases. They just are. And these numbers were screaming. Contracts were being paused. Creditors were calling with nervous inquiries. A $200 million deal for a new resort in Dubai froze overnight, the Emirati investors suddenly unwilling to commit. By morning, nervous whispers were echoing across the trading floors of Wall Street. Is the Sterling Empire shaky? Victoria, still swathed in her signature crimson, dismissed it all with a flick of her wrist. At a private gathering of her shrinking circle of allies, she was heard sneering. They're just overreacting. We've built towers bigger than their courage. Her laughter rang out, a brittle, fragile sound against the palpable silence of uneasy investors. But outside that bubble, the dominoes were not just falling. They were cascading. A powerful European bank announced a temporary review of their $1.1 billion line of credit to Sterling Enterprises. A major retail partner, a flagship tenant in several of their properties, delayed a multi-million-dollar payment, citing brand risk. Shareholders, once fat and happy, were now grumbling in corridors and firing off angry emails. Every arrogant step Victoria took created financial aftershocks she seemed completely incapable of feeling. And all the while, Ava Monroe said nothing. But her image, her presence, was everywhere. On social media, users created a damning diptych. On one side, Victoria Sterling, pointing with venom. On the other, a screenshot of the Sterling Enterprises stock price, a jagged red line plunging downwards. The captions were merciless. When arrogance costs you billions. The memes evolved. Farm girl? No, billion-dollar queen. In the boardrooms of their rivals, it was certainly no joke. One executive whispered to another during a meeting. She's killing them with silence. Every sponsor they lose makes her look stronger, more stable. Another replied, his voice a low murmur. The optics are lethal. They're bleeding not because she's attacking, but because she simply isn't speaking. Meanwhile, Ava's phone buzzed not with press inquiries, but with quiet, discreet messages of support. These weren't public tweets or grand gestures. They were direct offers from investors, partners, and even some of the Sterling's fiercest rivals. They smelled blood, but they also smelled opportunity. They wanted her calm. They wanted her credibility. They wanted her precision. She didn't answer them. Not yet. Timing remained her sharpest and most trusted weapon. Back in her office, she placed the black contract folder back into its leather case, sliding it across her desk to her assistant. Her assistant, a young woman who looked at Ava with a mixture of terror and awe, asked nervously, Do you want me to draft a statement now?" Ava shook her head slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "No," she said. "Let the numbers speak." And they did. Every hour, every day, they spoke louder and more brutally. As another sponsor pulled out and another investor retreated, Victoria Sterling, trapped in a spiral of her own making, doubled down on her bravado. She strutted into charity events, her chin held impossibly high as cameras flashed. But behind her, the glittering empire she so arrogantly flaunted had begun to tremble. The irony was poetic, almost Shakespearean. She had tried to humiliate a woman of dignity at the opening of a grand tower. Now, that same silent, unbothered, relentless dignity was humiliating her bank accounts, and the world was just beginning to watch. The firestorm, born online, refused to stay there. It spilled out from the digital world and into the concrete streets of New York City. By the end of the week, the Sterling's flagship building, the gleaming Olympus Tower, was no longer just a monument of glass and steel. It had become a stage for protest. Dozens of people, then hundreds, lined the public plaza at its base. They held simple cardboard signs, the words scrawled in thick black paint. Respect over riches. Dignity isn't for sale. Not your farm girl. $4.50 billion doesn't buy you humanity. What began as a few scattered voices soon swelled into a unified chorus. Students from nearby universities, office workers on their lunch breaks, even retired residents of the neighborhood who had once admired Richard Sterling's ambition now stood with a quiet anger in their eyes. Microphones from local news crews picked up their chants, which echoed between the skyscrapers, a stark, human sound in the canyons of capital. "We stand with Ava! We stand with Ava!" Television crews swarmed the plaza, broadcasting live images of a city's conscience rising up against its own arrogance. Commentators narrated the scene with a sense of incredulity. It is rare to see this level of sustained public backlash for a single insult, one anchor noted. But this was never just an insult. It was a symbol of class, race, and power colliding in plain sight for the entire world to see. Inside the Sterling's penthouse, the heavy curtains were drawn tight against the world. Victoria, draped once again in crimson silk as if it were battle armor, scoffed at the footage on her television screen. "Let them shout," she hissed to her husband. "They'll get bored. Towers don't fall because of a few cardboard signs." But outside, the pressure was mounting. The police were called, not to suppress any violence. The protests were steadfastly peaceful, but simply to keep order as the crowds grew larger each day. The chants became rhythmic, accompanied by the beating of makeshift drums, the voices unified and strong. Dignity over dollars, dignity over dollars. The public outcry emboldened investigative journalists to dig deeper. Old stories, once whispered in gossip columns, began to resurface. Tales of staff members being humiliated at galas, of young entrepreneurs being cruelly dismissed at networking events. A clear pattern of behavior emerged, all pointing back to the imperious conduct of Victoria Sterling. Each new revelation hardened public opinion against her, and, by extension, her husband's empire. And yet Ava Monroe remained unseen. She gave no speech to the protesters. She didn't march with them or pose for a camera-ready appearance. But her presence loomed over the entire scene like a silent, powerful banner. People began carrying posters not of her face, but of her silhouette, that iconic viral freeze frame from the ceremony. Her calm, unbowed figure in orange, a contract held firmly in her hand. To the people in the crowd, she was no longer just a businesswoman. She was an emblem of their own struggles against disrespect and dismissal. The advisors and board members of Sterling Enterprises grew increasingly restless. In tense meetings, voices clashed. One executive slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "We are losing the public. Every single chant outside those towers bleeds directly into our balance sheets." Another snapped back. "We can't control this narrative unless she apologizes." All eyes in the room turned to Victoria. She simply crossed her arms, her tone as icy as a winter morning. "Apologies," she said, "are for the weak." But weakness was already seeping through the cracks of their foundation. Deals were falling through faster. The share price dipped lower each day. Investors no longer just feared the numbers. They feared the optics of the crowds, and those crowds weren't going anywhere. Night after night, the protests swelled, the plaza lit by the soft glow of candles held aloft, their flickering light reflecting against the cold glass facade of the Sterling Empire. The chants never stopped. The message was unequivocal. The world had chosen a side, and the side it chose wasn't hers. The boardroom was deathly silent, save for the heavy, rhythmic ticking of an antique clock on the wall. A dozen men in dark, expensive suits sat rigid around the long mahogany table, their anxious reflections fractured in its polished surface. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling himself, his face a mask of stone, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Beside him, in a posture of defiant contrast, his wife reclined in her chair. Her crimson dress shimmered under the recessed lights, as if she were attending another gala rather than the funeral of her husband's reputation. An executive, the CFO, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense room. "We've lost 3 more major sponsors in the last 48 hours, he began, his voice strained. "Credit agencies are actively reviewing our debt structure. The market is watching us bleed, Richard." Another board member added, his tone sharp with accusation. "And it's not just the business. This is about personal reputation. Our name, the Sterling name, is trending for all the wrong reasons." Richard Sterling's jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped. He had built this empire from nothing, brick by painful brick, tower by glorious tower, only to watch it tremble and threaten to collapse because of a single sentence, a throwaway insult uttered under the glare of crystal chandeliers. His silence was heavy, the silence of a man forced to measure a lifetime of fury against the catastrophic consequences of unleashing it. His wife, Victoria, rolled her eyes with theatrical boredom. "Enough with the dramatics," she sighed. "It was one comment. People are fickle. This little storm will pass." But the storm wasn't passing. It was intensifying, accelerating into a Category 5 hurricane. One of the oldest board members, a man who had been with Richard from the beginning, leaned forward, his voice low but laced with a dangerous anger. "Victoria, your arrogance is costing us billions. You stood on a stage and mocked a woman who controls more private capital than half the people in this room combined." Her laughter was a sharp, grating sound, almost a mockery of itself. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. She waved a contract around on a stage and the internet crowned her a saint. "Do you all really believe she has the power to take us down?" The atmosphere in the room tightened. No one answered her, but their collective silence was heavy with a terrifying answer. Yes, they did believe it. They had seen the numbers. They saw the relentless protests outside their own windows. They saw the headlines multiplying like cracks in the foundation of a building. Richard Sterling finally spoke. His voice was gravelly, each word chosen and wielded like a shard of glass. "This empire," he said, his eyes never leaving his wife's face, "was built on credibility. Without credibility, the towers fall." His gaze shifted, lingering on her with a cold, unfamiliar sternness. And right now, you are the crack in our foundation." For the very first time, her smile faltered. It was just a flicker, a momentary lapse in the armor of rouge and confidence, but everyone saw it. She turned her head away, staring at the wall, refusing to answer. But the damage was done. After the tense meeting adjourned, Richard remained seated, staring out at the skyline that had once symbolized his absolute triumph. Faintly, through the triple-paned, soundproof glass, he could hear the rhythmic chanting of the protesters below. Dignity over dollars. Dignity over dollars. The sound seemed to cut right through the glass, a steady, unyielding heartbeat of his own undoing. He realized something then, a truth he would never, ever admit aloud. This wasn't just a PR disaster. This was an existential threat. And the woman who had triggered it all, the woman his wife had tried to publicly annihilate, hadn't needed to say a single word. While the Sterling Empire trembled from within, Ava Monroe moved across the city's complex chessboard with the silent, deliberate patience of a grandmaster. Her counteroffensive didn't begin in a press conference or on Twitter. It began in a private, discreet lounge on the top floor of an international bank, a room where the walls glowed with subtle gold leaf, and the city skyline stretched behind the glass like a conquered prize. She sat at a small, round table. She was not meeting with reporters or protest leaders. She was meeting with 2 men and 1 woman who, together, represented a global investment consortium. Their combined portfolios were so vast they dwarfed even Richard Sterling's considerable holdings. Ava didn't arrive with a dramatic speech or a plea for help. She didn't need to. She arrived, as always, in a dress of brilliant orange, a streak of controlled fire against the room's muted, earthy tones. Her black contract case rested neatly on the table before her. One of the investors, a silver-haired German banker, leaned in, his voice a respectful murmur. "Miss Monroe, we have been watching the fallout very closely. Billions of dollars in capital are pulling back from Sterling. His towers, his projects, they have become vulnerable. But your silence, your remarkable restraint, it has made you the absolute center of credibility in this market." Another, a sharp woman from a Singaporean sovereign wealth fund, added, "If you are willing, we are prepared to reallocate up to $4.5 billion away from his current and future developments, and toward yours." Ava didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist in celebration. She simply gave a single, slow nod, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the offer. The same number, the very same $4.5 billion that symbolized the tower where she had been publicly shamed, was now circling back to her, delivered as the ultimate weapon of leverage. Her response was precise and devoid of emotion. "I am not here to gloat," she said, her voice even and calm. "I am here to build. If you want to invest with me, it will be on terms of dignity and absolute equality. No shortcuts, no arrogance." The room was silent for a beat. Then, almost in perfect unison, the 3 investors nodded their assent. Outside that gilded room, rumors began to trickle through the financial press. Anonymous sources whispered of a major capital shift. Headlines began to speculate. Is the $4.50 billion Olympus Tower about to change hands? Analysts debated furiously on live television. Some said it was impossible, a fantasy. Others, who understood the brutal nature of the market, said it was inevitable. Meanwhile, Victoria Sterling, oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting beneath her feet, continued her campaign of self-destruction. At a charity luncheon, she raised a champagne flute and sneered into the microphone. "Some people in this city seem to confuse silence with strength. To me, it just looks like weakness." The cameras caught the smirk. Social media caught the breathtaking irony. The clip went viral instantly, not as a show of power, but as irrefutable proof of her spectacular blindness to her own reality. And in that stark, stunning contrast, Ava Monroe's silent move sharpened into a fatal blow. Ava didn't need to answer the insult. She didn't need to attend luncheons. The very markets that Richard Sterling once commanded were now quietly, decisively orbiting around her composure. By nightfall, Ava's assistant placed the black contract folder back on her desk. This time, it wasn't just a document. It was a symbol. The world thought this fight was about a personal humiliation. She knew it had always been about direction, about the future of the city's skyline. And now, billions of dollars were waiting for her to give the word. Her hand rested on the cool leather of the case. The timing was close. Very, very close. Silence had carried her this far, but soon her first strike would land, and it would be devastating. The walls were closing in, and Victoria Sterling was the only one who couldn't see it. The tabloids, once fawning over her fashion and philanthropic endeavors, now printed the most unflattering paparazzi photos they could find. The headlines dripped with ridicule, from high society to high liability. Her once glamorous reputation had become a toxic asset that no PR firm in the world could sanitize. Still, she refused to yield. In a move of staggering hubris, she organized her own press conference at a five-star hotel. She arrived draped in scarlet once again, defiance stitched into every thread of the expensive fabric. Cameras flashed like a lightning storm as microphones leaned forward, hungry for another gaffe. She raised her chin, her voice sharp with indignation. "I will not be silenced by online mobs or manipulated by false narratives," she declared. "I stand for tradition, for excellence, for keeping our industry in the hands of those who have earned it, not outsiders who simply bought their way in." The room went still. For a fleeting moment, she must have believed her words would land like thunder, a defiant roar of the old guard. But what followed was not applause. It was a collective intake of breath, a series of gasps and stunned murmurs, the sound of a crowd witnessing someone gleefully sealing their own fate. Within minutes, clips of her tirade hit Twitter. The phrase, "not outsiders," was replayed endlessly, dissected in threads, and mocked in memes. One viral tweet, which gained 500,000 likes in under 12 hours, read, Translation: "Not outsiders" means not black, not women, not anyone she can't control. The few sponsors who hadn't yet cut ties with Sterling Enterprises now rushed to issue statements. "We denounce all forms of discriminatory rhetoric," one said. The Sterling Empire was bleeding faster than ever before. Its board members grimaced on camera, refusing to give interviews. Behind the scenes, shareholders were whispering of emergency votes, of ultimatums, of a complete shift in allegiance. Behind the drawn curtains of the penthouse, Victoria paced furiously. "They twist my words! They always twist my words!" she hissed, hurling an empty crystal glass against the marble fireplace, where it shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. Richard, weary and hollowed out, didn't even flinch. He just stared out at the skyline he no longer felt he controlled. The protests outside doubled in size. Candles became torches. Chants became anthems. Some held up giant printed posters of her red-dressed sneer. Others carried the now iconic still of Ava Monroe, calm, orange-clad, and unshaken. The visual contrast was undeniable, a clear story of villain and hero. In boardrooms across the city, the whispers grew into open conversation. "She is actively dragging the entire empire down," one director murmured to a colleague. "Every single word she speaks costs us millions. Every day she refuses to apologize costs us billions." Victoria, oblivious and insulated by her rage, doubled down yet again. "They'll see," she muttered to herself. staring at her own reflection in the darkened window. They'll all see. I'm the one who belongs here, not her. But the world had already seen. Her desperation, once hidden behind a veil of champagne and chandeliers, was now projected onto every screen for all to see. The harder she fought, the deeper she sank. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet office high above the fray, Ava Monroe watched, unflinching, as the tide of consequence pulled her enemy further and further out to sea. The silence inside the Sterling penthouse was almost cruel. Once a symbol of untouchable success, it now felt like a bunker under siege. The curtains remained drawn, the phones buzzed with non-stop bad news, and aides whispered in hallways like priests delivering last rites. Richard Sterling sat alone at the vast dining table, a dozen untouched crystal glasses gleaming under the dim light of the chandeliers. Across from him, his wife, Victoria, still wore her crimson armor, her lips painted a defiant red, as if a smear of color could mask the catastrophic cracks in their empire. For days, he had tolerated her defiance, her arrogance, her refusal to see the damage she had caused. But tolerance was a luxury he could no longer afford. The CFO's latest report lay open before him. Red ink slashed across the pages like open wounds. Sponsors gone, partnerships frozen, billions in market value evaporated. The numbers didn't just bleed, they screamed. He finally exhaled, a long, ragged sound. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" His voice was gravel, low and lethal. She scoffed, swirling the untouched wine in her glass. "I spoke the truth. If people can't handle it, that's their weakness, not mine." His fist slammed down on the mahogany table. The crystal rattled, the sharp sound slicing through the suffocating silence. "Weakness?" he roared, his voice cracking with a rage he had suppressed for days. "You have turned my life's work into a circus. I built towers on credibility, on alliances, and you burned it all to the ground with a single stupid sentence." Her face hardened, her own voice rising, becoming shrill. "Don't you dare blame me because they are all threatened by her. She doesn't belong in our world. She never did." Richard's eyes narrowed, a storm brewing in their depths. "And yet," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "she is the one who is now holding the future of our world in her hands." The words struck harder than any physical blow. For a moment, all of Victoria's bravado faltered. She looked away, but her reflection in the dark penthouse window betrayed her. A visible crack of doubt, a flicker of raw fear. That night, the board members called an emergency session without her. Some demanded her complete removal from all public appearances. Others whispered of severing her influence entirely, of legally removing her from any company holdings. Their language grew sharp, merciless. "She is not an asset. She is a terminal liability." And for the first time, Richard Sterling did not defend her. He sat there silently, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his collapsing world, his eyes fixed on the screaming red ink of the CFO's report. Outside, the protests swelled ever louder, the candles and torches flickering like a swarm of angry fireflies against the glass of his towers. Inside, Richard finally realized he was at his breaking point. He could no longer choose loyalty to his wife without sacrificing the empire he had spent a lifetime building. "One more mistake," he whispered to himself, almost too softly for anyone to hear. "One more mistake, and we lose everything." And somewhere across the city, Ava Monroe, silent, calculating, and patient, waited. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to fight. Her enemy was meticulously unraveling from within. The breaking point had come. The final blow was imminent. The city awoke to a torrent of rumors. Financial news channels buzzed with frantic speculation. "Is a hostile takeover imminent?" Traders whispered of sudden, massive stock movements, of contracts shifting hands in secret midnight meetings. Something huge was happening, but only one woman knew the full scope of the earthquake to come. In the highest floor of her own tower, Ava Monroe prepared her final strike. She stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, the dawn light spilling across her orange dress like fire on forged steel. The contract, the very same one she had held so steadfastly at the opening ceremony, now bore a host of new signatures, powerful investors, international banks, global partners. The weight of $4.5 billion had been redirected, not away into the ether, but directly, decisively, into her hands. Her chief advisor entered the office quietly, his voice steady but tinged with pure awe. "It's done," he said. "The consortium has approved the final transfer. You now control a majority stake in the Olympus Tower." Ava nodded once, her expression calm, composed. There was no celebration, no gloating, just the quiet satisfaction of inevitability. "Then release the statement," she said. The news exploded within the hour. Headlines in bold, declarative fonts were splashed across every major news outlet in the world. Black CEO Ava Monroe takes control of $4.50 billion Olympus Tower. Sterling Empire fractures as new power rises in New York real estate. Cameras flocked back to the Tower Plaza, where the protesters, seeing the news on their phones, transformed their chants of anger into roars of pure joy. The signs that were once painted with outrage were now raised in triumph. "Dignity wins," one read. "The tower is hers." Across town, absolute chaos reigned in the Sterling headquarters. Executives shouted over one another while phones rang endlessly off the hook. The market value of their remaining assets plunged into freefall. Financial analysts on television were tearing the family's reputation to shreds. Richard Sterling sat in his office in a state of silent, broken shock, paralyzed by the sheer inevitability of his defeat. His wife, Victoria, stormed across their penthouse in a blind fury. "She stole it! This was ours! She stole it!" A board member, finally reaching Richard on the phone, snapped with unrestrained bitterness. "No, Richard, you didn't lose it and she didn't steal it. Your wife handed it to her. Every insult, every arrogant word. She personally gift-wrapped the leverage Ava needed to own you." But Ava Monroe didn't need their permission, or their acknowledgement. She was already walking through the polished marble lobby of her newly claimed tower. A surge of cameras and reporters pressed forward, desperate for her first words after weeks of silence. She paused in the center of the lobby, looking directly into the swarm of microphones. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, clear, and unwavering. "Power," she said, "isn't loud. It doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need to humiliate. Real power builds. Real power creates. Real power lasts." The plaza outside erupted in a wave of applause, her words reverberating across screens worldwide. And in that singular, powerful moment, she wasn't just a businesswoman reclaiming her dignity. She was a symbol. A black CEO who had masterfully turned silence into strategy, insult into an empire, and a $4.5 billion humiliation into her ultimate, undeniable triumph. The final strike had landed. Checkmate. The plaza was quiet now. The crowds had dispersed, the chants had faded into the city's memory, but the warm glow of victory lingered in the air, etched into the very steel and glass of the tower that now, unofficially, bore her spirit. Inside, on the top floor, Ava Monroe stood alone, her hands resting lightly against the cool glass, surveying her city. The skyline glittered beneath her, each building a monument to human ambition. But tonight, one tower told a story far larger than profit margins or architectural triumphs. It told the story of dignity reclaiming its throne. Reporters would call it the takeover of the decade. Financial analysts would write case studies about it, calling it a textbook lesson in silent leverage. But for the people who had stood in the streets, the students, the office workers, the mothers and daughters, it was something more than business. It was proof. Proof that silence could indeed roar louder than arrogance. Proof that a black woman mocked as a farm girl in front of 1,000 flashing cameras could turn the world's humiliation into her own empire. Victoria Sterling had vanished from public view. The once glittering hostess of galas and charity luncheons was now reduced to hushed whispers in tabloid columns. Isolated, shunned, and socially exiled, her arrogance was remembered only as a cautionary tale. Her husband, battered and weary, watched his remaining empire shrink, haunted by the knowledge that the fatal damage had not come from market forces alone, but from the hateful words he had failed to stop. Ava Monroe, meanwhile, did not gloat. There was no extravagant champagne party, no victory lap in the press. Instead, her first act as the tower's new majority owner was to gather her team in its largest conference hall. The long table glowed under soft, modern lights. She placed the black contract folder at its center and spoke with a quiet, resonant authority. "This is not just a building," she told them, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "It is a reminder. Every decision we make from this room must honor the principles that brought us to this point: dignity, equity, and the absolute refusal to bow to prejudice. If we ever forget that, we become no better than what we defeated." Her team listened, their eyes fixed on her, as if they were hearing not just a corporate directive, but a new manifesto. What a story. What a masterclass. What did you think of Ava's final silent takedown? Was it the most brilliant strategic move you've ever seen, or was it a cold, brutal act of revenge? Sound off in the comments below. I want to hear every single one of your thoughts. Later that night, as the city deepened into sleep, Ava walked alone through the vast marble lobby where it had all begun, the very spot where laughter and mockery had once cut into her like knives. Now, the cavernous space echoed only with the sound of her own steady, calm footsteps. A security guard at the main desk saw her and gave a respectful nod. And for the first time since that fateful night, Ava allowed herself the faintest of smiles. This tower was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It was hers, a testament, a legacy. And as the infinite city lights shimmered beyond the glass, her voice lingered in the silence, almost like a vow whispered to the world. "They said I didn't belong," she thought. "So I built my belonging into every stone of this city, and no one can ever take that away." The story was complete. And it wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of a legend. Thank you for being here, for watching, and for being part of this incredible journey. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of power, justice, and epic, unforgettable takedowns. Until next time.